Hey guys, nice to be here. Thank you for inviting us. This is a ton of fun for us. Um, I guess I can give a little bit of background on who we are as a company. Uh, we're around about 100 people who spend every waking hour scanning everything around us in every corner of the world. And we're trying to build the world's largest library for artists of scans and tools to make world building as fun and simple and creative as possible. So we've been around for about 8 years, and our core mission has always been to help push the 3D industry forward with new tools to help save time and increase quality in general. And so my name is Teddy Bergsman. I'm CEO and co-founder of Quixel together with Bakar Azim. And I've spent the past 16 years or so shipping away at what eventually became Megascans. And of course, together with my incredibly talented team and colleagues, including none other than Adnan Shomet and Richard Stevenson, who I am proud to have with me today. So before we move on, I also want to give a massive shout out to Magnus Larsson, who is the lead engineer behind the Houdini integration. Unfortunately, he can't be part of this webinar, but he's here in spirit because he helped us prepare kind of all the examples for this webinar. So big shout out to you, Magnus. So we will show you some fun videos of Megascans and Houdini in action, and then we'll dive right into the integration and all of the exciting tools that come with it. We will then end with some Q&A. But first, I'll let my colleagues Richard and Adnan introduce themselves. So Richard, feel free to take the lead.
Cool. Hey guys, thanks Teddy. So my name is Richard. I'm one of the tool devs here at Quixel, and I'll be running you guys through a few of the demos that we've prepared, some of the sample content that will hopefully help to explain some of the concepts and show why you should be using the Livelink tool today in production.
Hey guys, my name is Adnan. I'm a technical artist at Quixel, and I helped Magnus develop the Megascans Livelink. And today I'll be assisting Teddy in answering all the questions you might have about Megascans.
So I'd like to preface this by saying that we use a whole lot of Houdini here at Quixel for just about everything. So we're quite excited to finally release our first official Houdini integration, completely open source to the community. And our aim is to make photorealistic environment production with Houdini accessible to power users and beginners alike by combining simple procedural automation tools with a very powerful integration with the Megascans library. To kick things off, I thought that we could have a look at a fun video showcasing a few projects using Megascans and Houdini, actually by some of the talented artists here at Quixel. So let me go and share my screen. So there we go. All right. So the first two scenes that you saw were made by Owen O'Brien, running in Unreal Engine 4. And the last scene, the forest, was made by Richard Stevenson, who we are super excited to have with us in this call. So the Houdini integration includes quite a great deal of tools. And Richard will give you an overview of a majority of these tools without going too much into detail because we only have so much time. But we'll cover getting started with the Megascans to Houdini bridge, and the various supported renders, the many exciting production tools that are included, and how all of this can kind of be used for both VFX and game development. So I thought I'd quickly share with you a brief video overview before we move on. So let me go here and share. All right, so without further ado, I will give the floor to Richard.
So the installation guide for this is very, very straightforward. After launching Bridge, all you need to do is navigate to the asset you would like to export. Click on the export settings icon to the top right, set Houdini as the target application, and click on download plugin. This will download and install everything you need to get up and running with the live link for Houdini. Then over in Houdini, click on the new Quixel Megascans dropdown and select live link. From here, you can select the render engine and workflow of your choice, the many to choose from Mantra, Arnold, Redshift, and Octane. You can also pick between UV and triplanar workflows. So once this is done, you can just return to Bridge and export the asset. So if we give it a second, as you can see, the live link will properly set up the material, displacement settings, scale, and scene hierarchy all on the fly. So you can jump straight into creating art and less time performing tedious tasks like setting up your materials over and over. And hit render, and you basically get a beautiful render straight off the bat. So that's kind of a basic installation guide. The next thing we're going to look at is how to actually use these tools to set up a quick diorama scene. So the first thing you always want to make sure that you do is launch the live link tool, set the render engine that you want to be working with, and your material workflow. From there, you can just go into the bridge and export any asset of your choice. Depending on what you have selected in Houdini will determine its sort of content-aware sort of placement of that asset within Houdini. For instance, if you had this plane selected, when you export a material, it'll assign that material to that plane. So if we go back and export a 3D asset, it's going to be the hero of our scene. You'll notice that any 3D asset that you bring into Houdini will come in a very nice self-contained subnet inside. So all of the data that you need to work with that 3D asset is very neatly contained within that subnet. This makes creating much larger scenes very straightforward because you are guaranteed a very clean working hierarchy within Houdini. So I guess the core takeaway of this section is the fact that you can jump straight into things like composition and lighting and and overall look and feel of your shot without having to do tedious tasks. So if we just jump back into Bridge and search for one of these scatter assets here. So when you bring in scatter assets, the workflow is slightly different. So the LiveLink tool will automatically detect that it's a scatter asset and create a default scattering setup for you with a default grid that you can use to preview how your scatter density is going to look. So all I did there was change that to point to the 3D rock that we want to scatter on top of, and then you can start adjusting settings. So one of the tools that come included with the LiveLink tool is this Quixel simple scattering node, which allows you a huge amount of flexibility, granular detail to allow you to adjust your scatter systems exactly how you want them to be. You have filters like slope, curvature, and noise, as well as any attributes, density attribute that happens to be on the mesh when it feeds into the scatter node. You can use that to drive exactly where you want your scattering to occur. And then obviously the fact that you can run all of these parameters through curves means that you have just a huge amount of control over the fall of the distribution. So that's kind of it for the scatter assets. We'll look now at some 3D plants and bringing those in. So if we just jump back to Bridge now and look at some of the 3D plants and how we can use those. For the most part, the workflow is very similar to the scatter assets. They'll come in, it'll generate a plane that it'll be distributed on top of. All we need to do is dive in there, change the source of that scattering, in this case, to the ground plane, because we just want to scatter some clovers and things on the ground. And it's almost instantaneous, the feedback, right? So if we just jump in here and change the P scale down to match the scene scale of our scene, we can really just start diving into creating exactly the kind of the look and the feel that we're going for here. And that's pretty much it. If we were to launch a test render now, you basically get all of your materials are perfectly calibrated and set up for you. Here we're just tweaking some displacement settings and connecting up the bump app to the material, which with Redshift is an optional step. So it's disconnected by default, but you can hook that up if you want to. And with a few more tweaks to displacement and tessellation, scatter, density, and some shader setups, you can very easily achieve like a very, very nice result. So if we just jump ahead to something we tweaked it a little bit more, we get something like that. So yeah, very, very quick and easy to get up and running with the tool and actually start using it. So here are just some other examples of how the tool can be used. And we thought it was quite fun to put together this little looping animation. So one thing I want to point out here is that 3D plants will come in with a wind attribute inherited. So that attribute can be used to very easily generate wind effects for your scattered foliage. So in this example, it's very subtle, but it adds a nice touch. And here's just another example. So slightly more complex, a few more 3D assets that we brought in, but for the most part, the workflow is pretty much identical. It's just bringing in 3D assets, setting up your scatter systems, and painting density attributes, tweaking things, and yeah. So that's it for the basic introduction. Now we're just going to take a closer look at materials as well as the mixer node inside of Houdini. So in this example, we're just going to look at Redshift, but I'll show you in a second that the setup for other render engines is very similar. So what we're doing here is just setting up a sort of a ramp attribute, or color attribute that ramps from top to bottom. And we're just going to apply a quick cobblestone material to our test geometry now. So again, always have to make sure that the LiveLink tool is running. And in this example, we're going to be using the triplanar setup and looking at how that works. So within just a few clicks, you have your material fully set up. We launched the IPR, you can see how that's looking. We just need to tweak the displacement a little bit to kind of suit what you're going for, but for the most part, it's all there. So on the Redshift, Quixel triplanar node is another HDA that comes included with the tools. On there, it controls all of the texture outputs. So that's going to be reading everything from disk. And for the triplanar node, you have this blend amount parameter that you can tweak to get a smoother fall off between each projection axis. So the next thing we'll look at is actually using the Quixel mixer node, to get very nice height blending between different surfaces. So if we bring in, say, this mossy grass material, and we want to layer that on top of the cobblestone material, this is kind of the workflow of that. So because we're using Redshift, there's slight sort of workflow specific to that, but if you're familiar with how to blend various different materials together in other render engines, the process is quite relatable. So all we're doing here is exposing some of the blends and the different layers we want to have access to, and dropping down a Quixel mixer node. And that's going to read the displacement channels from each of the layers that you want to be blending. And from here, we just have to hook up the displacement blend into each from the mix output and the displacement channels, and as well as the surface channels. And then the output of that just goes into your surface, into your material. Okay, so if we just do a quick test render of that, you'll see we're getting some blending, but it doesn't look amazing, and it's not using that attribute we created earlier. So all we need to do is reference that in, and we can start making use of that. So we'll bring in that point attribute, set it to the name of the attribute that we created earlier, put that through like a set range. And if we relaunch the IPR now, you'll see that we're now making use of that attribute. So this is a pretty straightforward explanation of how to get that blending to work. But essentially, whatever attribute you had here, you could feed that in. So if we go and modify some of these settings, you can see it's looking okay, but it's not great. Like, you may want to actually go and swap out the grass material or the cobblestone material. And that's possible by just selecting a new material from the bridge and having a material selected in Houdini. And all you have to do is hit export, and it'll overwrite whatever you have selected. So it's a very quick workflow for doing look dev, maybe. You would just want to try out different examples. Maybe you want to try something completely radical, but you're not sure if it's going to work. You don't have to stress about it taking a lot of time to set that up. It's all done for you. So here we have a radius parameter on the Quixel mixer node, which just allows you to get smoother or softer or sharper blends between your different layers. Another thing to point out is that these Quixel mixer nodes can be daisy chained together as many times as you want. So you can create very, very complex materials of grass on top of cobble, on top of mud, and so on and so on. So yeah, that's kind of it for materials. And if we go and look at some examples here, so here we're just showing the parity between the different render engines. They all support, so Redshift, Mantra, and Arnold all support triplanar displacement. However, Octane does not. But in terms of the triplanar setup, it supports that workflow as well, just not triplanar displacement. And some examples, if you want to use it for like hard surface modeling or hard surface texturing workflows, if you want to quickly add surface detail to an asset without doing any sort of painting on this, you can use these procedural workflows. So every material here has been layered on. So you have the base blue material for this metal section. You have the warm sections on the corners. You have mud on top of that. And the same thing for the wooden handle, where you've got, the wood and then the sort of flaky section on top of that. Another great example with sort of powder coat with sort of metallic chrome underneath. And it's also incredibly useful for environment artists, right? Where you have, for instance, you could have 20 columns all next to one another, and you want to make sure that they don't all share the same texture. What you can do is use triplanar workflow, so you have axis-aligned texturing and 3D-aligned noise to drive your procedural blending, right? So in this way, each of these pillars look, more or less entirely unique, which is very useful. So next thing we'll look at is some of the scattering tools. And so we touched on this briefly before, but I just want to show the process just on a plot. So when we bring in a scatter asset, as mentioned previously, it sets up a scatter grid, right? So one very useful workflow for this section is that if you had a very complex bit of geometry that you want to scatter, say plants or weeds or something on top of, but it was quite high poly and difficult to work with to get like quick responses whenever you tweak parameters here. What you can do is set it up on a grid like we have here. And once you're happy with the scatter sort of distribution, scale, and so on, all you have to do is change the source input to point to your high poly geo, and you'll scatter on that instead. So it's a nice setup. And every time you bring in a plant, it's going to set up this. And you'll also notice that it creates a very nice self-contained subnet. So it keeps everything very neat and organized. Here's an example of using the scatter system where we can actually scatter other objects on top of your scatter system. So we have our first scatter system, which is scattering a bunch of plants on a grid. And what we have access to is the ability to then quickly scatter these light-emitting spheres on top of the plants. So you can create these sort of nested scatter systems. And this example just shows how we can create very detailed sort of mid to far distance assets. If you're not too worried about sort of intersections between different bits of geometry, you can use a setup like this. So all we're doing here is modulating the scale, color, rotation of these assets, but it's actually one single rock that we're scattering over this section. So just by modulating those few parameters, you can get very different results from this whole process. Yeah, and then just some other examples of how it's possible to get incredibly layered scatter systems using the tools. So, if you want to get nice natural looking clumping of your grasses or weeds on top of almost a layered effect of the rubble, you can very easily do that as well. Okay, so jumping to the next example, we'll look at the physics painter. Okay, so the physics painter is probably one of my favorite tools to play around with in Houdini. It's a lot of fun to just scatter bits, but one of the biggest issues or downsides to it is the fact that when you're working with the tool, you have to manually go in and fill in all the fields to point to the different scatter bits. So in this example, we're using this concrete barrier, and we're going to show just how the LiveLink tool speeds up this whole process. So with the physics painter, if you look here, we have this paint meshes. So normally you would have to go and populate this whole list, and that can take some time. So with the physics painter tool selected, if we make sure that LiveLink is running again, so with the physics painter node selected, if we jump back to bridge and export an LOD5 of any scatter piece, right? The LiveLink tool is smart enough to kind of see what's going on or figure out what you want it to do. And if you go back to the physics painter node, you'll see that the list gets properly populated for us. So we can basically start painting straight away. So you don't have any downtime in terms of your creative output in this process. It's literally, you click a couple buttons to bring up the LiveLink and export the assets that you want. But from that point on, it's you can just paint things and build up very, very complex assets from that. And one of the great things about that whole process is the fact that it allows you to just experiment with trying out new things, because you may find that if you are inclined to be slightly lazy about going through the whole same process over and over, because it is very tedious. This allows you to bypass all of those tedious tasks and just jump into the creative output kind of side of things. So with that done, we're just going to dry that paint layer, and I just want to have a quick tangent and show the so that's the output of the physics painter, but I want to show the output of sort of a game dev pipeline if you want to use an asset like this for a game, for instance. So what I'm going to do here is just repath this to point to the geo node of the physics painter and bring that in and just merge that in with the concrete barrier. There we go. And so this process has been covered a lot by the game dev team. I believe there's actually a node that kind of replaces this whole section, but we'll just run through it step by step for now. So what we're doing is just converting to a volume, reshaping that ever so slightly to retain the volume of that mesh a little bit more, and converting to polys, clipping that asset down, running through a poly reduce, and then creating UVs for that with the new auto UV tool in Houdini 17. So this gives us a perfect launch pad, if you will, to start baking stuff down and getting this asset into a game very, very quickly. So if we just set a few parameters on this and just bake that down and show you the result. So that's kind of what we get. So top left, we've got an asset that you would traditionally use for like an effects shot or something like that, whereas bottom right, we have our game res asset. And if you look at the wireframe, the game dev asset is perfect for dropping into a game engine of your choice. And speaking of game side of things in real time, the tool now works flawlessly with the Marmoset toolbag ROP, which is part of the amazing game dev toolset. So, if you are using that, it's just an amazing workflow, because it all the game dev toolset, the Marmoset toolbag ROP now works perfectly with the live link tool, so you can get very, very quick previews of your assets through there. And you can just get these amazing, real-time renders, which is super cool. But obviously, if you're more FX or non-real-time, then the tool works just as well for you. So the last example that we want to look at is actually how to merge a whole bunch of different assets from the library into one single highly complex structure, right? So we're going to take all of these, so the dead tree stump, the branches, an atlas, and sort of a mossy texture, and create this tree on the right. So to start us off, I'm just going to diagnose or dig through a scene that we've created for this already. And so if we jump into this, you can see it's made up of three main parts, right? So you've got your tree stump, which is this section here. If we dive inside there to see what's going on and go inside this node here, we need to create some attributes on here. And so we're using the edge transport SOP to generate some curvature or gradient data going from the base to the tip of the plant. And then from there, we can just run it through a curve. And that black and white value that we're seeing there is essentially saying where we want to scatter our branch geometry in the next steps. Next thing we're going to do is just measure the curvature, and here we're just going to show that as a color. So previously, where we generated that gradient ramp from top to bottom and used that to drive the sort of the blending between two different channels, that's essentially what we're going to aim for here. And so if we go and look inside the material for this, it's essentially exactly what we had set up previously, right? we just have a blend setup. We are using Redshift here again, so it's the exact same setup as before. So in this case, maybe we want to replace out the sort of the darker moss that we have in this crevice. So we can just go back to the library, go and find maybe a moss that we think is going to fit a little bit better, maybe this one here, making sure that the live link is enabled or running. We can just hit export, and that's going to go through and replace that, that HDA. So if we refresh that, now we have a different sort of moss material that's blending on top, which is very nice. Okay, so that's kind of the main tree trunk section. Then next we can look at the branches. So this is not specifically live link related, but it's showing creative ways that you can use these tools to build them up into something new. So in this example, basically all we're doing is taking each branch section and applying material, and in that for loop, what we're going to do is center each one so that the base of each branch is at the origin, and that just makes it very easy for us to scatter and know that they're going to be oriented correctly. And again, in this case, we're just creating a color attribute that's linearly generated from the base to the tip of every branch. Then when we source the base geometry in that we want to use to scatter the branches, all we need to do is run that through a polyframe to generate new normals for us, so that the branches don't stick out perpendicular to the main branch, but they kind of push in the direction. And we're using that attribute that we created earlier, which was using the edge transport. And that's basically it for the branches. And from here, we can look at the atlas setup that we have. So we haven't looked at atlases yet, but let's do that now. So with the atlases, we have a way of dynamically splitting those up into separate chunks and kind of rotating them to like best fit, so that we can plug and play an atlas like that straight into our model, right? So if you look in here, we have the source subnet, and in there we've got an atlas splitter. So if you check this out, we've basically splitting each atlas piece into its own bit of geometry, applying a bit of bend, and from there we have the ability to scatter that onto the branches. So from here, the setup for that is pretty straightforward. We're just running through the same simple scattering node as before, pointing it to the unpacked branch geometry. And yeah, that's basically this entire asset kind of created. And the amazing thing is that you can just modify a few seed values, and you would have a completely unique bit of foliage. So that's kind of the examples that I have to show.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Cool.
Great presentation.